Thank you everyone for joining us today or watching it after the fact. For those of you watching the recording, we're happy to be here today. We think that this is such an important thing to be talking about. I think we're all well aware on a regular basis of the fact that we are in such extremely politically polarized times. You know, if we start to think it's getting better, then the next day something happens in the news. It reminds us just how polarized we still are. And it was probably pretty apparent to most of us, but there's also research that backs up the fact that this lack of civil discourse is detrimental to a healthy society and well-being in general. So we'll do our best to keep it light, even though this is a very important and heavy topic sometimes. But so we just have a political cartoon for you here that says civil discourse matters. What a radical idea, right? Just radical's a little play on words there as well.
All right, there's ample research that also supports that we do put in place efforts to address civil discourse and increase civil discourse. And while we won't talk about doing that at the institution level, and there's research specifically at the institutional level, students in one study, 94% of them said, we need our institution to put in place at least one program to help increase civil discourse. So we will talk about it in the classroom, in sociology classrooms. And what our goal is, what our hope is that we can provide information that both reinforces and adds to what you're already doing in your classroom to provide a safe environment and to foster skills that you already are working on fostering, such as enabling students to build their knowledge base, critically evaluating research, effectively assessing the accuracy of that information, which is a huge challenge. And then once they've gathered that information, then they can have thoughtful and respectful discussions. So in this slide, we're just going to provide some key points, kind of like the foundation, what is needed for civil discourse. And then we're going to come back to these points throughout this short presentation. So clearly, we have to have students understand common errors that we all make and how we come to understand the world around us. And, you know, whether it's overgeneralization, selective observation, whether it's adherence to authority, we all make these common errors. So students need to become aware of them and check them. The other thing that is key clearly is backing our claims with sound, rigorous empirical evidence. So in order to do this, clearly we have to then assess the validity of sources as well as using multiple sources. And so what we have at the end, we have a slide on common errors. We have a slide, well, two slides that present some frameworks for assessing critical evidence. We have Really, it's a series of 10 videos that Stanford University put out on assessing digital information. And then there's 3 frameworks provided by the University of Washington that provides guidelines for assessing information. And you probably also have some other ideas of how you have helped students to critically assess evaluation. Critically assess evidence. So this next bullet point, as far as evaluating topics from multiple perspectives, well, sociology, that's what we do, right? So we're set to be able to help the students do this, and at the same time, like, acknowledging the limitations and the advantages of these different perspectives. Empathy is not often talked about as like a foundation, and Katie's going to touch on that a little bit more, but we've included incorporating empathy and understanding the issues. And then key, finding common ground. You know, they dichotomize either or, you're for it or against it. There's often common ground. And when we dig our heels in and don't listen to others, then it's hard to find that common ground.
Thanks, Laura. So, as Laura said at the end, when we don't listen to others, and that's the first thing that I'll mention in terms of, in order to maintain this foundation and to build on it, we need to help our students foster their soft skills to maintain civil discourse. And listening and active listening is right up there at the top. And this is something that's important for civil discourse, but also just kind of life in general, right? Interacting with others. This is something that so many of us struggle with. One of the first things that I, remind students of is that you're not doing active listening if when someone's talking, you're already thinking about what your response is going to be. And that's something that I know in regular life, such as with my partner, right? Sometimes that can be challenging. And so helping students to work on that. Empathy, as Laura said, this is one that I think is really important and that gets lost today and is more challenging when we're teaching online than when we're teaching in a classroom, right? We all know from social media that when we interact online, sometimes people forget that there's a human being on the other side of this. So this is one of the things that I always stress in my classes is to help students remember that when we talk about a social problem, it's not theoretical. There are people in the class that are going through it. At the institution I talk about, I have a lot of students that struggle with poverty. I've had many students who are experiencing homelessness, right? Many students, either themselves or a loved one has a history with substance use disorder. So helping them understand that when we talk about these issues, there are real people that are dealing with these issues and to maintain that at the forefront of this. And that really goes a long way for maintaining civil discourse. Helping students recognize that they can be respectful, and that does not mean that they're agreeing with someone else, right? Respect and agreement are two different concepts. And even if you don't agree, that doesn't mean that you can't be respectful. As Laura already said, this is such a big thing that we just think sociology is great for, is helping students to be open to other perspectives. One of the things that sometimes happens, though, is that we get tied with our personal identity to whatever perspective it is. So if you were talking about something politically, students identify oftentimes as a Democrat or a liberal or a Republican, and so they don't want to listen to the other side, and that's tied to their perspective. But most students don't come into classes and say, hey, I'm a functionalist, or I'm a conflict theorist, or I'm a symbolic interactionist. They don't come in with that personal tie to the perspectives. And so it's really helpful for helping them start to practice being open to other perspectives. Common errors, Laura mentioned, key one is overgeneralization. Again, many of us fall prey to this in our regular lives on a regular basis. I know I tend to do a better job whenever I know that I'm in a professional position than when I'm in my personal life at avoiding some of these things. But students oftentimes come in with that huge error of overgeneralization, particularly when it comes to their own experience and thinking their experience is representative. And we all know that that means that they are an N of one, and an N of one is not generalizable. So really helping them to start to understand that. And then also to gain awareness of biases. Again, we're all human. I find it really concerning when people think I have no biases. We all have biases, right? We live in this society where there are these stereotypes. We all breathe in the pollution of these messages that we receive. And that pollution, even when we can't see it, starts to impact us. So we have to try to gain awareness of what our biases are. And so helping students with that.
Right. So we have those foundational criteria, which include the soft skills. We also need the guidelines. We all have guidelines in our course syllabi, but it's helpful to have students come up with guidelines. And they'll likely add to what we have come up with and put in this in the syllabus for the course. So the students come up with these guidelines and then they discuss the guidelines and decide if they agree on all those guidelines. So we have just a short exercise that we want to just touch on that helps in the application of the foundation criteria needed for civil discourse. And in this exercise, you break the class. I'm going to just talk as if it's an on-ground class. It can be adapted for online. Break the class into small groups. Each group is appointed with a topic. You can use the same topic for all, or you can use different topics. But the topic has to be something where there's clearly you can argue for the issue or you can argue against the issue. Just a couple examples: guaranteed basic income, gun regulation. And then half the students in that group, they're assigned to bring evidence supporting the issue that they've been assigned, and the other half bring evidence that does not support it, that counters it. And so students are reminded what the goal of the exercise is, which is put put in place that we've just gone over as far as engaging in civil discourse. And they're also told it really doesn't matter where you stand on the issue. The assignment really is for you to find evidence to support whatever issue you were assigned. And in finding that evidence, then they use one of those frameworks that we've gone over and provided them with as far as how to critically assess evidence. So they come back to class, and each of the students in the small group, they share the evidence that they found. And once all the students in that group have shared the evidence, then that's when the crux of the exercise really starts. Because what we want them to do in the processing of it is we want them to talk about, oh, were there common errors that I made, or were there common errors that because I made them in my own life, or I know I've made them, I tried to avoid making in doing this assignment? What was it like using those frameworks to critically assess the evidence? Were the frameworks helpful? Were there ways in which they weren't helpful? Did I actively listen? Or did I hold back from jumping in? Was I really trying to understand, not agree with necessarily, but understand where that counter side was coming from? Did empathy come into play? Is there a way we can find common ground? And that's one of the things we want the students to talk about after they do some processing is is there common ground to be found? So the processing again is the important part of this exercise. And then an option at the end, we can have the students just take just a couple minutes and on their own, for only them to see, write out how did this exercise I did help me gain some understanding about myself and how I engage in civil discourse. Anything you want to add, Katie?
No, I think this is so great. It's so different. When I started teaching quite a long time ago, I used to have my students do a debate. And when you start this exercise, students start to feel like it's a debate, but this importance, as Laura was just stressing, in the processing and tying it back to civil discourse and active listening, looking for common ground, all of those things. And I think it's really great, actually, if someone is assigned something that they don't agree with. I don't know about you, but when I think about arguing against something that I feel very passionate about, I think that I would benefit from doing this on a regular basis, right? I think we all would. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Right. And I think that's part of sociology classes. Students can't really argue strongly for their position if they don't know the counter position and the weaknesses in the counter position and the weaknesses in the position they're taking.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned this a little bit previously, but I'm sure many of you would agree that sociology is just primed for us, helping students to learn civil discourse and to practice civil discourse. That contemporary social problems, which is the focus of the course and the book that we're going to talk about, is especially primed in social problems. There's so many hot topics that, again, students do feel very passionate about. And so it can, if you don't have these guidelines in place and haven't helped students with this, it can devolve pretty quickly. So it's really a key way that we can help them practice it. So many of our concepts in sociology really help lean towards this, the sociological imagination, right? So many students come in with just an individualistic perspective. And so just helping them to start to move beyond that and to recognize how social structure and social forces enable and constrain our individual lives and decisions goes a long ways. The sociological perspectives, which I mentioned earlier, right? Students don't typically come in going, oh, I'm a conflict theorist or I'm a functionalist. They don't know what those concepts are. And so it helps them practice taking on those other perspectives and being open to other perspectives and being able to see that even if they lean one way, they can start to see a little bit how someone can view it from another perspective, at least. Helping them to start to see how inequities and intersectionality interplay in all of these concepts. We'll come back to this when we talk about some of the social problems that we focus on, right? But recognizing that social problems do not play out equitably across all social statuses, that some social statuses are impacted more than others. And, some people have multiple aspects of marginalized statuses, and so they experience that intersectionally. Right. Thank you, Kimberly Crenshaw. And then awareness of interconnectedness of social problems, helping students to start to do that, that can help them start to be aware of just how complex things are instead of the way, they tend to get these sound bites in our larger society. And so helping them see that it's more complicated and they're interconnected, and to start to work on that. So just all of the things that we do in sociology and social problems in general just prime us for applying all of these soft skills and helping them to start to adhere to the guidelines for civil discourse. So, uh, again, for social problems, we want to talk a little bit about how we do it specifically using this book, Understanding Social Problems, a case approach, which we wrote after a lot of experience. And so I'll let Laura take off from here and then talk about it a little bit more.
Okay, thanks, Kate. So between the two of us, we have over 30 years of teaching contemporary social problems. And both of us have used various contemporary social problems books and really good social problem texts that are out there. But what for us was lacking was drawing our readers in, drawing our students in to real life situations to help them more clearly understand what's going on in the lives of these people, or that these are people, okay? These aren't just numbers we're talking about. And so what we started doing, actually, each of us, is we started using some nonfictions. Katie used Poverty in America. We've used Evicted. We've used Just Mercy, Half the Sky. Use these different nonfiction books that I think are excellent, but they didn't cover the breadth and all the topics that we wanted to include in a contemporary social problems text. So we got to talking about how can we draw those students in with a narrative. How can we get that, like the best of both, right? Draw students in with a narrative, but also include that background factual information so that the reader connects both on an empathic, really visceral level and a cognitive level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think at one point, the most books I assigned, because I was trying to cover sets of breadth, I had assigned 6 books in a semester level class when I was teaching at a semester school. And now I teach on a quarter system, and I've tried to assign 4 or 5 books. And that's a struggle for students, especially in a 100 or 200 level class. But I was doing that because I was trying to get to the breadth of the number of issues through these nonfiction books. So what we tried to do is, again, kind of marry some of that key stuff from good textbooks with that narrative empathic issue. So the way we set up this textbook is with 2 foundational chapters that are covering all that key information that you would expect: sociological imagination, sociological perspectives, common errors, which Laura mentioned earlier, as well as some just basic research information. There's also an appendix with some additional research information because I'm a big fan of that. See, Laura's laughing because she made me move a lot of that to the appendix because I wanted even more of it in there. I cover research in all of my classes. I'm a big believer that students need to be critical consumers of information. And as I tell them, that's not just a sociology skill, that's a life skill, right? And it's so important in today's age. And of course, ties into being able to have civil discourses, being able to be critical consumers of information and not be, spouting off just whatever they heard on TikTok this week. So we have 2 book foundational chapters, and then we have 10 chapters that focus on a social problem, variety of social problems, things that you would expect: poverty, crime, child abuse and neglect, substance use, mental and physical health, climate change. I'm not going to try to name every single one of them. And I'll talk about this as well. One of the things that we made a decision on was to not have specific chapters on inequities like race, gender, ability, but instead to build that into each of those major chapters to try to talk about how climate change impacts people differently, right? So people who are experiencing poverty and people of color are disproportionately impacted by climate change. I tell my students, I think one of the things that's so troubling about climate change is those who contribute the most are impacted the least, and those who contribute the least are impacted the most, right? And so helping students to start to understand that. So we have these longer narratives that start each of those 10 chapters that focus on a social problem. So I say longer because if you look at a traditional textbook, there'll be a box typically on a page that are try to kind of pull this in, but it's pretty short. So longer meaning in a traditional textbook, what you would see over 2 or 3 pages of a narrative case study to pull the students in, as we've said, to that empathic side of things, and then switch to that factual background information you would see in a textbook where you get policy information, statistics, as well as some additional conceptual information. And then it goes back to that same narrative, the same case study to again pull it back into that at the end of that. Then there's a really short conclusion chapter at the end. So we try really hard to help students see the complexity of the issues, to be aware of preconceived ideas, right? To move beyond those common errors that they may have come in with, their stereotypes that they may have walked in the door with, and then help them practice these skills throughout their discussions, requiring them to back all of their claims with solid evidence, whether I'm in the classroom or online, right? In a classroom, I'm kind of always prompting them, where does that come from? What tells you that that's true, right? How did you assess that information? And online, I make my students cite in all of their discussion boards. That's one of the ways that helps it from devolving into, just an opinion-based, debate that isn't based in that. Again, maintaining that civil discourse and just helping them process the content of the book, practicing these skills, both written and orally, in multiple formats. So we'll give you a couple of examples and again, kind of expand on a couple of the things that I mentioned earlier. So as I said, we made the decision not to have a chapter on race by itself or a chapter on gender by itself, which, I tend to find problematic because then people think about race as if it exists in a silo, and it doesn't, right? We exist as our race and our gender identity and our nationality and our ability and our sexuality, all of those things all at the same time, right? We're never just a single social status. So helping students start to think about intersectionality at the same time as starting to think about how those inequities play out for these different social problems. So in the narratives, you'll see people from different races, different gender identities, different personal backgrounds, to start to try in that, as well as to try to help students move beyond some of their common stereotypes of who they think experiences poverty or who they think experiences homelessness, because the narratives are showing them this variety. And then helping students assess the issues from different perspectives. We've already mentioned the sociological perspectives, but also when we're talking about an issue like poverty, structural versus cultural explanations, and to help them start to assess what might be the strengths or the limitations of some of those issues. And similarly with the data, showing them things like the official poverty line versus the supplemental poverty measure and helping them assess what are the strengths and limitations of that. Point in time data, how we typically measure how many people are experiencing homelessness, helping them start to understand, well, who's missing in that? What point in time might be problematic, like in 2021, when we pretty much didn't do point in time besides asking shelters because of COVID, right? So helping them start to realize, what is influencing the information that they're looking at.
So the other chapter we'll just touch on real quickly here, one that's just so emotionally charged right now, such a critical topic that there's definitely so much animosity and concern around right now. In our chapter, what we've done is in all chapters is try to build that empathy. And we did it in this chapter this is a chapter I wrote, and there's 2 teenage girls. One is in the United States, documented. The other doesn't have papers. She's not undocumented. And they're with their actually single parents at this point because of what's happened to other family members. But it is written in such a way that for the students to understand this could be your family. These are challenges that these people are facing they came to this country because they needed to, because they wanted to have a livelihood, and for various reasons it wasn't happening in their home country. So just letting students get to see the real humanity in the characters, in the families. And then we have this background section. And believe me, it is a challenge for me to set a neutral tone, but my goal is always to set a neutral tone and really to have other people like read it and say, okay, so am I presenting data that counters where I'm coming from? So the students then have to see there are varying perspectives, and you might have been fed one perspective. Here's another perspective to look at. And in the research that's been done, they then can assess what are the strengths and weaknesses of that research. But in that background section, also just talking about historically how immigration has been handled in the United States. Times that we've welcomed them and we've wanted them, and times that we've pushed them away. Most of our students don't understand that it's not easy to come to the United States with documentation. For some of them, that means years. They can get to the country with because they don't even have the money to go through the process. So helping them become more informed also with this topic, also helping them counter some of those myths that they're hearing or reading about constantly with social media today. So that's just a little bit about that chapter. But I think when we talk about policy in that background section too, and then in this chapter, actually, I have the students try to come up with what do you think would be a reasonable policy? I mean, it's not a full-fledged thing, but what are some of the elements? What is common ground that we might be able to find with this issue? So, and all of it backed by empirical research. And I always tell the students, if you find solid empirical research that I haven't covered, bring it to class. If there's something that you can say that counters something that we've been talking about, then by all means share it, because we're here to really learn from each other. So that's pretty much I think what we want to talk about as far as what's in the text. Katie, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, let me just add one thing. So you were talking about, immigration, and again, this is something that's changing constantly. So I did want to note one of the reasons this textbook is online only is that we chose that format so that we could update it regularly because this stuff is constantly changing. This book first came out in August 2023, and we've already done 2 full revisions updating the data. We're very committed to doing that, but it's right, as you know, if you do a print book, by the time it comes out, you're looking at data that's even older. So trying to stay up on that and make sure that, again, they're getting the most up-to-date information.
That's feasible.
That's
With
possible.
immigration, we can't update it on a daily basis, but as often as
Right.
possible.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, our last couple slides, Laura had mentioned, we provide just a list of the common errors that are covered, such as overgeneralization, selective observation, inaccurate observation, illogical reasoning, resistance to change, and adherence to authority. Those are all ones that we cover in terms of those common errors. And then the frameworks that Laura mentioned earlier coming from Stanford and University of Washington, which the students are required to use, like in that example exercise. So those are provided to you for extra information. We're not going to cover those in detail. We want to make sure we leave space for discussion and questions.
Thank you so much. And if you do have questions, please use the question and answer, the webinar chat to ask questions for Katie and Laura. I have a few already. We're getting lots of requests for the publication as well. So if you're interested in looking at it for potential adoption, please reply in the chat and we can get you access. Katie, Laura, how have students reacted to using this narrative or case study approach?
We have since we're sociologists into research, we have obviously have surveyed the students and got their input, and we have been very, very pleased with the positive feedback we've gotten. The students, they like those narratives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say they always love all the background information, but they do. They like that it is coupled with a narrative. It helps them relate to the topic more and think through the topic more. And also, I think, understand that background information more.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been like we've both done surveys. We'd be happy to provide that information if somebody wanted it, with both quantitative and qualitative questions, which has been just overwhelmingly positive. Yeah.
What's the source of the narratives? Are they written by you or are they through a third party source? Where do they come from?
We wrote them 100%, and they come from a variety of places. I'll give an example. So, the child abuse and neglect chapter, I worked at child abuse and neglect, what is DCYF here in Washington. And so, changing all of the information, of course, no demographic or names or anything in there, but those were based on cases that I actually had. So, that's where, those came from. Some of the others are come from a compilation of research. You want to share about your research that?
Yeah. I mean, my background is like policy and poverty. So, and I've worked for organizations that do a lot of different topics that sociology covers. So, gathered information from those sources as well.
What's the impact of AI on students finding evidence for their positions? I know this is a big one right now.
It's huge.
It is. It's a complicated one. So I'll say one thing is whenever I type in a sociology question to AI, I've been pretty pleased actually with the answers that have come back. So that makes me breathe a little bit easier, but it is challenging to teach in this day and age. I've got my own methods. Recently, I've been requiring my students to write everything in Google Docs so that I can run a program called Draftback so that I can make sure it's not being AI generated. Um, but again, at least the information on AI is help, good. It ties into actually to social problems because AI uses so many resources, and that we talk about climate change in our book. So that's one of the things that I talk to my students about is like, know the impact of the things that you're doing. Are you concerned about climate change? Well, then how does this thing that maybe you're doing thoughtlessly every day impact that? And to try to help them to make some of those information choices, again, without necessarily telling them exactly how to think, but showing them how to evaluate information and assess that. So,
Oh. I'm not well versed on AI. And Katie, I think, does a really good job of making sure that her students are using it appropriately. But I do think AI can have a place. It's a single, I would consider it a single source. We can never use a single source, right? There's lots of errors still with AI. So they always need to back up what they find with AI. And if they use an AI source, they have to cite it. And if I find out it's not cited, they know that's plagiarism. But the other thing that I do, and I tend to rely heavily on, is I in addition to the book, they might have watched a film or a video or read some articles. They have to draw and interconnect all that information. Okay. So AI is not really the source to go to help them do that. And as I present the question. So that's how I've tried to help students think on their own and integrate information on their own.
Are there instructor resources available to accompany the publication?
Go ahead, Kate.
oh, well, I was going to say there's discussion prompts for more open-ended questions. There's also knowledge checks built into it that the students can do within the textbook itself. So that's a couple of things that are in there, as well as some additional extra resources are listed at the end of each of the chapters.
Yeah, and the knowledge checks, I don't want to be high school, but it is a way to make sure the students read the material because they can't really engage in the discussion questions if they haven't read it or if they've only read a snippet of it. So at least they've had to skim it. But I find with the answers that I'm getting, the students have read the material.
One
I mean,
last one.
I'm not saying 100% have, sorry, not 100%, but the majority.
Do either of you, and if so, how do you teach this course online?
Yeah, we've both
Both of
taught it
them.
online. We both taught it both in person and online quite a bit. So it is something, actually, I have a colleague who told me that they're scared to do discussion boards in a social problems class because of this issue of civil discourse. So they just have students do all writing assignments directly to them and they don't read each other's. And I totally understand that, but I also think that students learn a lot from reading each other's and hearing about their different life experiences as well. And they can challenge each other sometimes in ways that I'd be cautious in challenging a student. Sometimes they
That's
can
true.
challenge one another. So I like the online discussion aspect the same way I like a lot of discussion in the classroom. I try to, when I'm in person, do a little bit of a flipped classroom. So I try to apply that as much as I can in an online format. And so again, I require students to cite in their discussion boards. I require them to do quality replies to one another. And a quality reply does not mean I liked your post. That's great, right? But that does not count as a quality reply. A quality reply adds on information. It asks questions. It provides clarifying information. Another example, right? Those sorts of things. And students seem to do a pretty good job. I mean, in today's age, students are pretty used to things. So once you get the first week or two down, again, getting those guidelines in place and they start to understand that, then it tends to go pretty smoothly, I have found. I think students are sometimes pretty open about their experiences as well as sometimes they'll talk about how shocked they are. They're like, I had no idea, and they'll express that. And so I think that's good for them to share and to hear from one another as well.
Yeah, I pretty much just echo what Katie just had to say.
You find that students have the research library skills to find the evidence-based information?
No, but I mean, the library at where I've taught, they do a good job of having sessions to work with the students. I mean, the students have to take advantage of it, right? But they do a good job of helping students, so we can encourage the students to utilize that.
Yeah, I think I do a combination of, I have at times asked librarians
To
to
come
come
in.
into my classrooms. They'd have online workshops at my school. I encourage students to attend those, or provide recordings for them, as well as talking about it myself, right? They really can't
I
hear it
think,
enough. And when, I'll use an example for the paper that I assign in my class, longer than the online discussion boards. I direct them to scholarly databases, which is one of the requirements that they use scholarly sources in it. And so I give them examples. I explain to them that Google is not, right? They can use Google Scholar, but those are different. So just helping them to practice that and learn that. Some of them are aware of it and some of them are not, and some of them just need a reminder.
and just to reiterate what Katie said, I mean, there's a lot of information coming to the students at the beginning of the course. So going over it with the students, even if they have gone through it at the library, and doing it specifically for your course. And for a number of years, I thought, I shouldn't have to do that, right? These are not they're getting this other places, but they're not always getting it other places. So really, in the end, it's worth, just like it's worth for me to take a little time to really make sure they're grounded in the foundation. It's worth it to make sure that they have the ability to go out and get sound empirical evidence.
Mhm. Yeah, if you're tech savvy, and different. I've used Blackboard, I've used Angel, I've used Canvas. The institution I'm at now uses Canvas, and I'll have to say it's my favorite. But if, as you're tech savvy, if you set up the classes, it's really easy to build links in that help the students. You can direct them to, places like for citation, like OWL Purdue, I love as a place. And so I have a little link. They can just click on it and, links to the databases like JSTOR and the different things that they can use to help them with that. In addition to just going and asking the librarians who are, again, so helpful. So a lot of our students are used to that. And so just providing them things so that they can help navigate that helps a lot.
One last question. If you could describe the paper assignment that you use, is it an argument or?
So actually, I still love those nonfiction books. I'm a big book lover. And so I still have them read one. And so they all have to pick a book and they can't duplicate it. So I have a list of like 45 books I give to students, and I also tell them that they can pick another one. It must be a nonfiction book. It must be substantive in length. So I'll give you an example of a good nonfiction book that they have to read. A second book is Night by Elie Wiesel about the Holocaust. That's a nonfiction book. It's great, but it's tended to be on the short side compared to a lot of the other books. So if they want to read that, they have to read two. So they have a lot of books about just a plethora of issues. So we cover such a breadth of issues, and yet there's still stuff that I know some students want to dig into more, or we don't get into, like the food industry. We don't really get into the food industry. And if the students have a passion about that, that can be something that they can use a nonfiction book about that for their paper. And then they have to apply sociological imagination, sociological perspectives. They have to come up with a potential solution, explain how you would test that solution, and then they have to share about that book with their peers. And I tell them that I always like my dream, and don't tell me that I might be failing, but my dream is that when they hear about the other books, some of them might read some of those other books as well. So that's the paper that I use. So again, I still have them read one of those nonfiction books in addition to using this textbook that everybody reads.
Katie, Laura, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thanks again for having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having us, and thanks to everybody who joined us or watch it after the fact.
Great. I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.